To introduce Karim El-Rawi to you. I had the pleasure of meeting and working with Karim during my year at the American University in Cairo last year. Just a little bit of background on Karim. Karim was born in Alexandria, Egypt. At the age of 14, he moved to Britain with his family, went to school and took 2 degrees in engineering, worked for a while as an engineer, and as he went back for his PhD in engineering, the writing bug hit him. From that followed a quick succession of residencies with various theatre companies in Britain, including the Theatre Royal Stratford East, and then on to the Royal Court Theatre, which is probably the #1 theatre in the world for new writing. From there, Karim took on the joint artistic control of a company called the Joint Stock Theatre Group, which is a group dedicated to longer rehearsal periods and maybe forming a more organic type of a play based on research and interviews and digging in depth into a particular subject. That's the reason Karim's here on the ISU campus. Karim's working with a group of theater students on trying to find a play based on what it is like to be the other or an outsider here on the campus. We're looking into the question of us versus them. One of the last things I did in Egypt before I came back here to ISU was work on a play called Crossing the Water, written by Karim El-Rawi, which was a play about the last days of the British in Egypt. If you were to classify Karim's writing, I think he deals very specifically with the question of home, cultural identity, and racial discrimination and prejudice. And some of his talk tonight, which is on censorship, and his experiences on censorship, will deal with Crossing the Water and some of the experiences that came directly out of that. So, enough of me, Karim El-Rawi.
Well, thank you. I know it's a Monday evening, which is always difficult, but bear with me as best you can. This evening we're really splitting up the evening into three parts. This first part, where I will talk a bit, is really by way of introduction to a reading of a short play of mine, which was written for the Royal Court Theatre. Later this year they're doing a season of short plays about the Middle East, and no doubt the interest was sparked by the Gulf War and the crisis in the region. So this is my contribution to that to that evening of short plays that they intend to do. Last year they did a similar season of dialogues, as they call them. So the play is really quite static, but in fact the way we're presenting it is probably even more static than it need be. That's really because we've only had a few hours to rehearse it and for the actors to become familiar with the material. So that's the second part of the evening, and the third part is really a discussion, and if there's anything arises out of what I say in the next half hour or 3/4 of an hour and the play, and people want to pick up certain points and questioning me about it, then that's for that part of the evening. There's a formidable array of technology here, which I find very intimidating. But I did write out a lecture, but as I just hate listening to people reading from lectures, I've also done out some notes, so I'm going to try and use the notes as much as possible, and when I get stuck I'll refer back to the more detailed lecture that I wrote out. The thing about censorship in Egypt is that it is directly tied to the British invasion, which took place in 1882. My own experiences of censorship are to do with censorship in Britain and in Egypt. So in fact I will take the two subjects together, and because they are related historically anyway, that will be my approach. The British invaded Egypt to put a stop to a democratic liberal revolution that was a revolution against absolute monarchy and against the feudal system in the country. They also invaded the country to secure their route to India. India was then a British colony, and the British were obsessed by a fear that the French or the Russians might try and grab it, and that Britain being so far away, the British would find it difficult to mobilize troops and forces to defend their colony. So in 1882, the British bombed Alexandria and landed, and eventually defeated the forces of the revolution, the Liberal Democratic Revolution. It was mainly a peasant army with support from some of the middle classes in the cities. Censorship was introduced into Egypt by the British in the early part of the century, basically to counter the criticism of the British administration in the country. Theatre in Egypt has a long history, although it is a lost history for most of the time. It's believed that in the Pharaonic period, which is around 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, plays were being performed in the temples, mainly religious plays about the triumph of Horus, the sun god, over Seth, the god of chaos and death. After about the Roman period, which was about 2,000 years ago, there is very little in the way of accounts of theatre in Egypt, although it is known that for several centuries there were groups of traveling players. In Arabic they're called muhabbazatiyya. These were groups of performers who would go round to villages and produce a play on whatever was the topical subject. They would sit around for a day talking to the locals and get an idea of what the burning local issue was, and they would improvise a play on the subject. Contemporary theatre in Egypt can be dated from around the middle of the last century, when translations of French plays, mainly Molière, were entering the Arabic language. These translations were made by Lebanese writers and by Egyptian writers. And these plays were taken up by the Muhabbazatiyya companies and performed. So, but they were Arabized. They were Arabized in their setting and in their humor and in their tone, so that they became virtually new plays. So Tartuf became Sheikh Ma'loof. So it became a play about a Muslim clergyman rather than about than about a Catholic priest. Generally, these plays had a large element of improvisation added to them. Towards the end of the last century, with the development of a liberal democratic movement, a poet by the name of Abdullah Nadim started to use theatre as a means of promoting liberal ideas. He set up Alexandria's first real theatre, and he travelled around with a company of players performing his plays in the Delta region in the northern part of Egypt, in villages to farmers and peasants. When the revolution broke out, the Liberal Democratic Revolution broke out, he became one of its most articulate spokesmen, and it is a measure of how dangerous the British thought theatre was that after they invaded the country, they put a price on his head. It is also a measure of how popular he was that he was able to remain in hiding for 10 years before being caught. He outlasted all the other revolutionary leaders who, one by one, were caught and exiled. So theatre had a foundation in political criticism, which was then taken up by other nationalist leaders. So Mustafa Kemal, who became the founder of the National Party, the main anti-British party in the early part of the century, wrote a play which, to my knowledge, has never been performed. Recently I read it, and it's not a terribly good play. Like many plays written by political activists, it's a bit kind of, it hits too many nails on the head in a very obvious way. It's supposedly set in Muslim Spain and about the attempt by the Christian forces to defeat the Muslim invaders, and how they're thwarted by a united action by the good guys. Censorship was introduced to Egypt by Lord Cromer, a man who later became Lord Cromer, who was the Governor General of Egypt. The irony is that Lord Cromer, after the First World War, also became the Lord Chamberlain in Britain, the man who enforced censorship on British theatre. So the ties between censorship in the two countries are quite close. Not only censorship was introduced into Egypt by a British Governor General, but that man also became the imposer of censorship in Britain. Censorship through the Lord Chamberlain was abolished in Britain in 1968, and it's only now, 23 years later, that the green boxes that contain his papers from 1901 to 1968 have become available. These green boxes were kept at St. James's Palace. They were the possession of the royal family. There was no access allowed to them. It's finally been decided that to reveal the contents of these boxes is no longer a threat to the security and stability of Her Majesty's realm. Theatres being so dangerous these days. In fact, some of the material has been retained longer than a lot of material that is withheld on the British Secret Services. The MI6 and MI5 have a 25-year, most material has a 25-year limit on its secrecy. Some of these documents have been secret since 1901. I've managed to get a letter that was in one of these boxes, or a copy of a letter in one of these boxes, which was a letter sent by the Lord Chamberlain to the writer Graham Greene, the novelist and playwright. This just to give you an idea of the kind of things that preoccupied the Lord Chamberlain. The letter is as follows. The Lord Chamberlain appreciates the atmosphere which the author is trying to produce. At the same time, he objects, in principle, to the pulling of lavatory plugs and all that stands for. In this respect, he feels that he would have, as he always has to have, a majority of feeling behind him, meaning a majority of the British public would be outraged to hear a lavatory flush off stage. From your point of view, I realize that you have started with the idea of the symbolism which the lavatory creates, and it is therefore difficult to think that anything else will produce the results you are after. But I suggest that to anyone who has not been born in the lavatory, a sufficient atmosphere will be achieved by noises of water running out of a sink. In fact, I have heard many a sink make a noise like a well-behaved lavatory. In view of your difficulties, the Lord Chamberlain is prepared to hold up the license of the play, which will not incommode you during rehearsals. A very lavatorial expression, but never mind. As this plug business is the only cut required. This will, he hopes, give you time to decide that the lavatory is not necessary. In this case, If you write and say you wish this deleted from the script, a clean license will be sent to you. The Lord Chamberlain cannot agree to a tryout on first production in the provinces. Yours truly. As you can see, these are matters of pressing importance that would be very difficult for the Lord Chamberlain to ignore. The Lord Chamberlain, as with the censor in Egypt, is not accountable to Parliament, or was not accountable to Parliament. He was accountable directly to Her Majesty the Queen. So that when Lord Jenkins of Putney, a former arts minister, had attempted to table a parliamentary question, he was told that no minister had responsibility for the Lord Chamberlain, and the question therefore could not be asked. The Lord Chamberlain's deliberations were to be kept confidential, and that confidentiality was to be tighter than that around MI5 or MI6. In fact, censorship was first introduced into Britain in 1737, when the then Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, objected to Henry Fielding's latest play, which portrayed him in a light that he didn't enjoy, and so empowered the Lord Chamberlain to check all plays. The Lord Chamberlain viewed himself as a nation's conscience. It was for him to decide what was moral and what wasn't. Their role was to keep nice positions in the theatre, to keep the theatre clean. One of the writers that the Lord Chamberlain objected to most strongly was in fact Noel Coward. The Vortex was described by the Lord Chamberlain, again in one of his letters in the Green Box, as a play that with its adultery and its cocaine-taking among the upper middle classes was a piece calculated to convey the worst possible impression of social conditions under which we live today, and therefore the play was to be banned. H.H. Higgins, a solicitor on the advisory board for the censor, wrote, "The real objection is that it presents the prosperous of today in an odious light, and to that extent it partakes of the nature of socialist propaganda." So Noel Coward was listed as a socialist propagandist. The Lord Chamberlain, in his own hand, wrote, "This picture of a frivolous and degenerate set of people gives a wholly false impression of society life. The time has come to put a stop to harmful influences of this kind." He found the play weak and unpleasant. He then referred to King George V to see if His Majesty would support a ban. The King wrote back that the play was truly disgusting, but would not be banned. The Lord Chamberlain would fearlessly rule where others feared to tread. So, for example, the Archbishop of Canterbury was unwilling to either bless or damn Eugene Briot's 1917 play Damaged Goods about the threat of syphilis. But the Lord Chamberlain stated, "Venereal disease seems to me a subject essentially unfit for description or discussion, no matter how good the motive for such discussion might be." In 1917, during a devastating war that was tearing Europe apart, the Lord Chamberlain appealed to the King to allow him time so as to discuss whether this play should be performed or not. In the end, the play was given a license because, sorry, I've jumped a line. Was given a license as all profits were to go to the National Council for Combating Venereal Disease. Therefore, it was a charitable act. In fact, a number of classics also faced this problem. Pirandello's 6 Characters in Search of an Author was a play that was held up for many years before receiving a license, as was Strindberg's Miss Julie. In the first place, wrote the censor, there is a sordid and disgusting atmosphere which makes the immorality of the play glaring and crude. Then there is the very questionable theme in these days of the relations between masters and servants, which this play tends to undermine. The implication was, of course, that once English ladies saw this play, they would find themselves unable to control themselves with their servants. And coming up to the 50s and the 60s, we find the Lord Chamberlain taking an equally antagonistic line to the writings of John Osborne or Edward Bond. John Osborne's plays were described as anti-authoritarian. Mr. Osborne is blatant, and which causes him to write in a deliberately provocative way. He's talking, the Lord Chamberlain's talking about the play A Patriot for Me. By presenting homosexuals in their most attractive guise, that is, dressed as pretty women, it will to some degree cause the congregation of homosexuals and provide the means whereby the vice may be acquired. Edward Bond's 1965 play, Saved, was called a revoltingly amateur play. The writing is vile and the conception worse. Peter Brooks's play, US. Not only is the play beastly and left-wing, but it is, judged the Lord Chamberlain, be offensive to responsible foreign opinion, meaning, of course, the government of the United States of America. In fact, the Lord Chamberlain consulted the Foreign and Colonial Office to see whether the Foreign Secretary would take a stand against the play. George Brown, the then Foreign Secretary, did not wish to intervene, so the Lord Chamberlain decided to give in and allow the play a license. More recently, I've had experience of a different sort of censorship in Britain. The Lord Chamberlain was abolished in 1968, but in 1979 we had Margaret Thatcher elected for Parliament. A fine match for any Lord Chamberlain. Through the 60s and the 70s, or rather by the end of the 60s and all through the 70s, censorship seemed to decrease in the theatre. What changed a lot was the Falkland War. There a new theme entered British politics, which is the theme of kith and kin. Britain went to war in the early 80s to retake a group of barren rocks in the South Atlantic, inhabited by a few sharecroppers and several thousand sheep. The theme that was used to drum up support was the theme of kith and kin. Although given the number of sheep on the island, one was justified in questioning just who the kith and who the kin were, and quite what Mrs. Thatcher thought she was referring to. The theme of kith and kin became a part of how the Arts Council decided to reorganize itself as funds became more and more in demand, and as their budgets were cut. During the 80s, I was on one of the advisory committees of the Arts Council and on a panel that gave out a considerable amount of money to to small touring companies and to writers. Increasingly, we were being told that companies that had large numbers of ethnic minority actors were to be considered as community companies. That is, companies performing to their communities, not companies that were really meant to break out of the ghetto and sally forth into the big wide world. The clearest example of this to me was in a discussion with one of the drama officers in 1988, early 88, where I was trying to argue that the idea of integrated casting was important. That is, that black people should be entitled to play any role in a play and not only where a part was specified as being for a black or an Asian actor. The drama officer informed me that this, to the best of his knowledge, was now common policy, and he had just been to see a play called Ridley Walker at the Manchester Exchange Theatre. Well, I'd seen Ridley Walker, and yes, there were a large number of black actors in it, but they were playing the non-speaking parts of a pack of hunting hounds. I pointed this out to him, which caused him great embarrassment. And I also pointed out to him that I felt that many of them would prefer much larger parts in maybe less prestigious companies. But certainly, when the cuts came round and companies were being cut, it was really the companies that were originally so-called white companies. In other words, companies that were usually companies that were set up in the early 70s when the number of black actors was a lot less, and were now trying to aggressively adopt a policy of integrated casting. Foco Nova, for example, was a leading company of producing new plays that had increasingly been producing plays by Afro-Caribbean writers or writers of Afro-Caribbean origin, and using actors also largely of Afro-Caribbean origin. And this was one of the first companies to be cut, and it has been followed by several other companies. The thing about how censorship operates is that it is an attempt at silencing a voice that one doesn't want to hear. And whether it's a classic or a new play, it is equally odious. So, for example, in the early part of the century, attempts were made in Britain to prevent performances of Oedipus Rex, a play by Sophocles that was written several thousand years previous to its first performance in Britain. Again, referring to the Lord Chamberlain's documents, the Lord Chamberlain wrote, "I have very grave doubts as to whether the public performance of Oedipus might not prove injurious." He went on to complain about its indecency, and he went on to talk about how it challenged authority and questioned the legitimate sources of political power. This for me is interesting because it suddenly illuminated something that had been mystifying me for the last couple of months, which is an Arabic language performance or production of King Lear, which I saw recently in Egypt. Now, King Lear was produced by the British Royal National Theatre Company and was brought to Cairo last year. It was performed in full in English. The Talia Theatre, which is a word meaning vanguard, so the Vanguard Theatre in central Cairo, which is supposed to be a new play theatre, and sometimes is referred to as the experimental theatre, did a new version of King Lear, where, as one reviewer wrote, that the long and boring speeches were cut. In fact, so much was cut out of the play that it had to be built as a farce by William Shakespeare, in which the jester became the principal character. Some reviewers thought this was great and said that the play was all the more moving for being a comedy. But what the Lord Chamberlain's letter about Oedipus clarified for me was the climate that censorship creates. It's a climate of concern and worry and fear, where everybody's worried about what their boss might think, or the person who might give out the money might think, or what somebody in the government might think. So a play like King Lear, which is about a doddery old man who rather messes up his life and his kingdom and messes up his daughters' lives as well, to put it a bit crudely, could be construed just as the Lord Chamberlain said, an attack on authority and on the legitimate sources of power. So better treat it as a farce, and then bill it as a play by Shakespeare, just in case anybody thinks it's by anybody else. The way censorship also, well, this is a case in point of how censorship works in translation as well. Because in fact, one way of dealing with foreign plays, where you don't have direct control over the writer, is to ensure that the translator does your work for you. So that the play is caught as it enters the language, at source. So, for example, Pinter's play, Mountain Language, was performed last year in a new translation by a university lecturer. Mountain Language is a play about power, about sex, about language, and it is also a play about the Kurdish minority in Turkey. In fact, the Middle East is an area of the world which is full of minorities. So in fact, it is a very relevant play, and one of the few British plays that you can say truly addresses a Middle Eastern audience. There are Kurdish minorities in Syria, in Iran, in Iraq. There are also other national minorities such as Armenians, such as Nubians in southern Egypt, such as Berber in North Africa. So it is a play that addresses the relationship between power and language. And so it is a play that is a good candidate for being mistranslated. The mistranslation is then given credit and given authority by being published in prestigious theatre magazines. It is also given prestige by being given a large production, a large-scale production, at somewhere like the Cairo Opera House, which happened to this play more than once. And in this way, it becomes unnecessary for anybody to refer to the original, because the translation is being given so much credit. But what censorship also does is it creates an anxiety. Towards the end of last year, I think it was November, there was a seminar at the Cairo Opera House in which I was asked to be a keynote speaker. And I mentioned in passing that for me one of the big differences between writing in English and writing in Arabic is that English is a language created by its writers, while Arabic is a language created by God. By that I meant that the Arabic language is tied to the Quran, to the Holy Scripture, the Muslim Holy Scripture. The Quran is written in Arabic. It is the Word of God. It is how God addressed mankind. The Bible, it is generally accepted as a translation. It may be divinely inspired, but it is still a translation. The Quran is not a translation. It is the words as spoken. It is the yardstick by which the Arabic language is measured and judged. It is the source of our grammar. It is the source of our syntax, of our vocabulary. And any attempt at playing with the language could be construed as an act of blasphemy. The result was an uproar, with people from the floor asking to speak, and speaker after speaker standing up and saying that there's absolutely nothing wrong with taboos, that every society has its taboos, and actually using the English word taboos, that every society has its taboos, and it's quite natural that a writer should respect that, and respect the society and the people among whom he lives, and not challenge those taboos. To me, that is one of the primary functions of any writer, is to challenge taboos, is to question, is to challenge tradition, is to challenge what has become untruthful in any society. One of the principal enforcers of censorship in Egypt is the Islamic Research Foundation at the University of Al-Azhar, which is one of the oldest universities anywhere in the world. Its main subjects are jurisprudence, Islamic jurisprudence, and language. It is generally referred to as an Islamic university, as a religious university. It's the university out of which most of, I was going to say clergy, but Muslims don't recognize that there is a clergy in Islam, whereas in fact, in practice, there is. Over the last year, the Islamic Research Foundation has banned several books. One of them was a novel, The Void in a Man's Mind, by a writer called Ala Hamid, because it claimed that the book contained atheism, blasphemy, and a denial of all religion. The writer was duly arrested in March 1990. The trial started in May for blasphemy and is still continuing. He has been released on bail after falling ill. Another victim of the Islamic Research Foundation is Dr. Hamid Abu Ahmed, who was translating a novel by Mario Lausa, the Peruvian writer who killed Molero. And he is charged by offending against public morality. So in a country like Egypt, one is facing two problems. One is facing a state censor, and one is facing the problem of religious censorship. What tends to happen is that the anxiety can reach such a stage that when a play does get banned, as in the case of Crossing the Water that Greg mentioned, the writer, in this case myself, finds himself ostracized. People don't know quite how to treat you. You've been construed as a bad boy, but how bad, they don't really know. They know you're not likely to be arrested or anything, but it's going to be difficult for you to get your work done. It's going to be difficult for you to get theatres to produce your plays. So they want to appear as the good guys. So what happened in my case was I got several phone calls from people I barely knew, telling me how naughty I'd been, and that really I should go to the censor and apologize. And what didn't help was that I did go to the censor and argued with them for 3 hours. I took with me a very well-known journalist, so it was a bit embarrassing for the censor to throw me out, because he just didn't know what my relationship to this guy was. And then when I was interviewed by several papers in Egypt about myself, and I mentioned censorship, I found that the articles were published without any mention of censorship. So my very purpose for doing the interviews was negated. So I wrote articles for the British papers about being censored in Egypt. And some of the material in the play is taken directly from that. I wrote an article for The Guardian, which was then banned from entering the country that day. I then went to the British Embassy and picked up a copy, because that came in the diplomatic bag, photocopied the article and distributed it to make sure that everybody knew that there was an article. And this seemed to kind of enrage some people, who then would meet me in the street and argue with me. By that stage, my level of paranoia, which is normally quite high, was getting higher, but somehow I had this drive to kind of to increase the antagonism. And so when the Royal Court got in touch with me and asked me to write something about the Middle East, I just couldn't resist writing something about censorship. I then duly informed everybody I knew there, that everybody working in theatre in Egypt, that I'd done that, and showed them copies. And in fact sent a copy to a magazine who had asked me for some material to publish. Not surprisingly, they decided not to publish it and came back and asked me if I'd had anything else. I said no. So I'm not expecting to see anything in that magazine again. But something that must be understood, I think, about, and I'll wind up now. One of the things as to why there is censorship in a country like Egypt, and why I think there will be censorship in any society that is a religious-based society. In the case of Egypt, and I'll speak specifically about Egypt, but I think it can be generalized, you have the problem of language, the language of God, the language that you cannot play around with. There is a style of language that you are allowed to use in the theatre, which is essentially colloquial, but in fact is a stylization of the colloquial, so that it is even more vacuous than the colloquial. It becomes very difficult to deal with ideas without resorting to using the language as it should be written, as it should be spoken. And yet if you were to do that, you can't get a license. And so when I do that, I have to produce my plays privately. That is, I get a theatre space, I do a deal with a theatre. So far I've been using one of the university theatres. I do a deal with the theatre department that I will adapt a play for them, or I will do some workshops with students. They give me the theatre space to use, and then I put on the play without any publicity, just using the telephone and without selling tickets. That is then legal, and it's permitted, and it's considered to be a private performance. So that's one way of getting one's work done. But another major problem that one faces is to do with the present state of the Middle East. We are in decline. Culturally, economically, we are in decline. Despite the oil, despite everything else, we are culturally in decline. This makes people very anxious. And there's constant references to our glorious past, to the days when there was an Islamic empire from the southern borders of France right across to the borders of China. And somehow there's a feeling that because we had a glorious past, we are going to have a glorious future. If only we can work out the formula. And this formula is buried somehow in our past. And therefore, the task is to uncover that formula. Tradition, being the remains of that glorious past, tradition being the root to that past, cannot be challenged, should not be challenged, must not be challenged. Because if it does, then maybe we will lose what thread we have that connects us to our glorious past, and therefore lose our way to a glorious future. What seems to be left out of the equation completely is any sense of the present and what's going on. And maybe it's because our present isn't so attractive to us that we want to avoid thinking about it. We've just had the Third World War take place on our territory, where Arab fought Arab. Egypt, once a major ally of Iraq, was one of the main contributors to the war effort against Iraq. Egypt contributed more troops than almost any other of the Allied forces, except for the United States. So what one is contending with is a threat of, or is being accused of being unauthentic, of betraying one's past, of betraying a possible future. And therefore, and you will hear an extract from a letter that I received after Crossing the Water was banned and after I kicked up a fuss about it. You will hear this used in the play, and you will see just how much the censor can overreact to what they construe as a provocation. Well, I'd like to hand over now to the cast of Secret State, and if anybody has any questions after the play, then I will be available for comment. Shall I introduce you? Comfortable like that? Okay. Are you comfortable like that? Yeah? Face the audience. Fine.
The building is large and old, a block of apartments sequestrated in the 50s, now an annex of the Ministry of Culture. There is no sign outside, no plaque stating it houses government offices, as is commonly the case. In the unlit hallway, I asked the concierge for the offices of the censor. He points me away from the main stairwell and elevator to what was once the garbage disposal chute. There, a small elevator has been constructed. It takes a moment for me to see it. My eyes aren't accustomed to the dark. The elevator has 3 buttons: ground, 9, and stop. I press the button for the 9th floor.